The Book of Ruth in the Bible consists of 4 chapters. Below is a breakdown of the scriptures found in each chapter. Ruth, chapter 1, Ruth 1:1-5. The story begins with a famine in Israel, and Elimelech, with his wife Naomi and 2 sons, moves to Moab. Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. After 10 years, both sons die, leaving Naomi and her daughters-in-law widowed. Ruth 1:6-14. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem upon hearing that the famine there has ended. She urges her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, but Ruth refuses, clinging to Naomi. Ruth declares her loyalty in the famous passage, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Ruth 1:16. Ruth 1:15-22. Naomi returns to Bethlehem, and the people are shocked to see her. She tells them to call her Mara, meaning bitter, because of the hardship she has faced. The chapter ends with Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Ruth, chapter 2. Ruth 2:1-3. Ruth goes to glean in the fields, a custom where the poor gather leftover grain after harvest. She happens to work in the field of Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's husband. Ruth 2:4-16. Boaz notices Ruth and asks about her. He learns that she is Naomi's daughter-in-law and shows her kindness, allowing her to glean among the sheaves and giving her extra grain. Ruth is amazed by his generosity. Ruth 2:17-23. Ruth returns to Naomi with the grain, and Naomi praises Boaz for his kindness. She tells Ruth that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, a relative who has the right to marry a widow and preserve the family line. Ruth continues to glean in Boaz's fields. Ruth chapter 3. Ruth 3:1-5. Naomi, seeing that Boaz has shown favor to Ruth, instructs her on how to approach Boaz. She tells Ruth to wash, anoint herself, and go to Boaz's threshing floor at night when he is in a good mood after the harvest. Ruth 3:6-9. Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. She goes to Boaz, lies at his feet, and asks him to spread his cloak over her, symbolizing his role as her kinsman redeemer. Boaz is surprised and pleased by her request, as it demonstrates Ruth's faith in him and her loyalty to Naomi. Ruth 3:10-15. Boaz praises Ruth for choosing to seek him as a redeemer instead of a younger man. He agrees to fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer, but first, there is another relative closer than him who has the first right to redeem. Ruth 3:16-18. Ruth returns to Naomi, telling her all that happened. Naomi tells her to wait, as Boaz will not rest until the matter is settled. Ruth chapter 4. Ruth 4:1-6. Boaz goes to the town gate, where legal matters are settled, and finds the closer relative. Boaz offers him the opportunity to redeem Naomi's land, but when the relative learns that he would also need to marry Ruth, he declines, as it would affect his own inheritance. Ruth 4:7-10. The relative formally gives up his right to redeem, and Boaz takes on the responsibility of redeeming the land and marrying Ruth. Boaz publicly makes the transaction in front of the witnesses. Ruth 4:11-12. The witnesses and elders bless Boaz and Ruth, praying that their descendants would be like those of Perez, the son of Judah. They wish Ruth and Boaz prosperity in building a family. Ruth 4:13-17. Boaz marries Ruth, and she conceives a son named Obed. Naomi, who had lost her husband and sons, is now filled with joy as she cares for Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David. Ruth 4:18-22. The genealogy of Ruth and Boaz is provided, ending with King David. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Ruth 4:18-22. Key verses: Ruth 1:16. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Ruth 2:12. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth 3:9. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Ruth 4:13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The Book of Ruth is a powerful story of redemption, loyalty, and God's providence. It is also significant for its place in the genealogy of David, which ultimately leads to the lineage of Jesus Christ. The Book of Ruth is a small book in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and is part of the historical books. It tells the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who becomes the great-grandmother of King David. The book is known for its themes of loyalty, faith, kindness, and God's providence. Summary of the Book of Ruth. Setting and background. Ruth 1. The story is set during the time of the judges in Israel, a period of social and spiritual upheaval. The story begins with a famine in Bethlehem. Elimelech, a man from Bethlehem, moves with his wife Naomi and 2 sons to Moab, a neighboring country. Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left with her 2 sons, who marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. After about 10 years, both of Naomi's sons die, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth widowed. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem and urges her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab. Orpah agrees, but Ruth refuses, famously declaring her loyalty to Naomi and her God. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's kindness. Ruth 2-3. Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem, where Ruth goes to glean in the fields to provide for them. Ruth happens to glean in the field of Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's deceased husband. Boaz notices Ruth and shows her kindness, ensuring she is treated well and providing extra grain. Naomi encourages Ruth to seek a closer relationship with Boaz, and following Naomi's advice, Ruth approaches Boaz at night, asking him to be her kinsman redeemer, a custom in Israel where a relative marries a widow to preserve the family line. Boaz redeems Ruth. Ruth 4. Boaz agrees to marry Ruth, but there is a closer relative who has the first right to redeem her. After this relative declines, Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed. Naomi takes care of Obed, and he becomes the grandfather of King David. Key themes: loyalty and faithfulness. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and to the God of Israel is central to the story. Her faithfulness is rewarded, and she becomes part of the lineage of David. God's providence. The book illustrates how God works through ordinary events to accomplish his purposes, guiding Ruth and Naomi through hardship to a place of blessing. Redemption. Boaz's role as the kinsman redeemer is a significant biblical theme, pointing to the larger concept of spiritual redemption in the New Testament. Theological significance: inclusion of Gentiles. Ruth, a Moabite, is one of the few non-Israelites included in the genealogy of King David, showing that God's grace extends beyond Israel. Foreshadowing of Christ. The concept of the kinsman redeemer is often seen as a precursor to the work of Jesus Christ, who is the ultimate redeemer for humanity. The Book of Ruth is often celebrated for its positive portrayal of women and its message of hope, redemption, and God's faithfulness. It stands out as a narrative of grace and love, offering a contrast to the tumultuous period of the Judges.